Hi everyone, this is Dave Clark of EXE Consulting, and it's May of 2017. In this video, I discuss the room modeling program I call RoomConvp, spelled RoomConvp, and its rotational variation that is spelled the same but with ROT at the end. Assuming a sample rate of 44,100 samples per second, this room modeling program models a 12,500 cubic meter concert hall and allows the user to construct various recording scenarios, in particular instruments spread around in a semicircle around the listener in a concert hall. The overall method of this acoustic modeling is equivalent to solving the acoustic wave equation in three-dimensional space inside a room. Unfortunately for the user of this program, understanding of some basic principles of acoustics is necessary to get the most out of the program. I'll try to keep it really simple because it's not necessary to understand all the math and physics to use the program. However, some basic stuff would be really helpful. This is going to be somewhat abstract in places, but I hope that those of you who watch this video get enough out of this to start using the program effectively. You may need to watch this more than once, just like you might have had to read chapters in math or science books more than once. Below, I do repeat some things several times, coming at the subject from different angles to help you out. Let's start with a room that is in the shape of something called a rectangular parallelepiped. That's just a room with parallel walls and a ceiling and a floor that are also parallel. This is an extension into 3 dimensions of what a rectangle is in 2 dimensions. In this figure, I've labeled the axes of the room such that front to back is X, left to right is Y, and up and down is Z. I've also placed a source in red and a listener in blue on this representation of such a room. I've placed circles here, the centers of which are where the source and listener are actually located. The line segments under the circles represent the distance to the floor. In this figure, the distance is meant to be the same for both. The source and listener also have the same Y coordinate. That is, they are the same distance from the left and right walls. They do, however, have different X coordinates. The source is closer to the front wall. Let's first consider what a direct wave is. It's the wave that first arrives from the source at the listener without bouncing off any walls or the ceiling or the floor. It's what you might consider to be the ultimate dry part. It's what you would hear in an infinitely large room or in a room that has 100% absorbent walls, ceiling, and floor. If we place a directional microphone, such as an ideal pressure gradient microphone, at the position of the listener, and we point it straight at the source, we would get a recording of only the front to back components of the direct waves, because the location of both source and listener include the same Y and Z coordinates, only the X coordinates are different. Reflections would, however, after bouncing around in the room, begin to come in more and more from all directions, so there would begin to develop waves that also had left-right and up-down components. In other words, the Y and Z components, in addition to the front-back or X components. Sometimes the reflected waves have pressure gradients, that is, differences in pressure, that are aligned with the direction of the microphone. Sometimes they are orthogonal or at right angles to the microphone, and sometimes they are aligned with the opposite of the direction of the microphone. Usually the pressure gradient at any one particular time is not aligned with the microphone, nor is it orthogonal to the microphone. In the general case, the X, Y, and Z components are attenuated by differing amounts due to misalignments between the pressure gradient and the direction of the microphone. For those who are familiar with vector arithmetic, the resulting amplitude is the scalar dot product of the pressure gradient and a vector that represents the direction of the microphone. For those who are not familiar with vector arithmetic, all you need to be aware of is that the microphone does not record the pressure gradient, but instead records the portion of the pressure gradient that is aligned with the microphone. This becomes important when you begin to consider different positions of the source compared to the listener, and when you consider how reflections and reverb develop as time progresses. It explains why you hear the things you do when you move sources around and or change the volume and absorption knobs of the program. Hopefully this will become more clear later on. If we use two microphones in a stereo coincident pair as depicted in this second figure, we would record the same components as before, front to back, for the direct wave, but at a smaller amplitude because the microphones are now at an angle. As before, reflections would still begin to come in from all angles. Now, if we also elevate the source or the listener, the direct wave would contain some Z component as well as an X component, because from the microphone's new positions, there would be an upward or downward movement for the direct wave in addition to the front-back movement. The direct wave no longer comes straight at the microphones from front to back of the room. If we also then move either the source or listener to the left or right, then the direct wave would contain X, Y, and Z components. The direct wave would then come front to back, left to right or right to left, and up down or down up. Instead of using two microphones that are a stereo coincident pair, one could use four microphones that are aligned with the axes of the room as shown here in this figure. There is a left-facing Y and a right-facing Y, plus the X and Z microphones. We can record using these microphones, then use a mixer to mix these components together to create different kinds of sounds that would be like aiming the microphone in different directions and or approximately like moving the source around, but all resulting from just one recording session. This is what the volume knobs, Vol, LR, etc., in RoomConvp do, but they start with a default orientation with all volume knobs maxed out, so 45 degrees to the left and right, plus 45 degrees of elevation. Then allow the user to decrease the volume for each of these components. But always keep in mind that the location of the source in relation to the microphone also plays a role as described above. The virtual microphones are truly coincident in the program that I used to solve the wave equation, so the left-facing and right-facing microphones record the same thing but with the signs switched. That's why there are only 3 volume knobs, not 4. The 4 signals are combined in 2 different ways, resulting in the right and left channels. I myself do not often use the volume knobs except to modify the right-left positions a bit from the chosen location, turn left-right volume down a bit, or to brighten the sound, turn front-back volume down, or darken it, turn ceiling-floor volume down. But an understanding of how the signal is constructed from components should help in understanding what you hear as you change positions from, say, center to left 45 or right 45, and when you do decide to change one or more volumes. Absorption. In a real room, each pair of walls and the floor and ceiling have different audio characteristics due to the materials used to construct them, and the surfaces themselves are at different distances from the source and listener. So in this program, I added absorption parameters, ABS, LR, etc., to allow the user to decrease absorption for the three directions: left, right, front, back, and ceiling, floor. I have not as yet included different materials, but I may add this at a later date because I've been aching to try it out for years. Even without different materials, you can easily create very different sounding reflections and reverbs with just these absorption knobs alone. This is where I spend almost all of my time once I've chosen a position of center, left 22, or whatever. There are two different absorption models, exponential and 1 over x. The 1 over x model was originally intended to approximate the exponential decay, but I found that I liked it so much that I retained it in this version along with the exponential decay which I introduced in this version. All directions use the same model chosen for absorption. You may hear hiccups in the audio when changing or switching absorption knobs, for the exponential one in particular, because it has to do a lot of calculations for any new setting of absorption. As an aside to think about, for some of you anyway, absorption has an interesting effect on the spectral characteristics. Rather than higher frequencies decreasing in magnitude faster than lower frequencies, in this program, components in different directions decay at different rates, causing dynamic spectral behavior at a short time scale that sounds very realistic to me. In this program, decay is much more complicated than usually described in discussions about it. In this next figure, I'm showing a source at a 45-degree angle from the listener. The way in which this configuration works is interesting, but also confusing. But it's a good example to restate some of what I've already said. When the volumes of the microphones are maxed out, the X and Y microphones combine in such a way as to reinforce each other for the front to back and left-facing left to right microphones. Therefore, they produce a loud direct wave and therefore signal in the left channel. But because the right-facing left to right microphone has the opposite sign from the left-facing one, the front to back and right-facing left to right microphones cancel each other out for the direct wave in the right channel. However, and as before, as reflections come in from more and more different directions, signals from reflections start showing up in both left and right channels. The signal originally comes from one direction, then begins to come from a few other directions for early reflections, then more and more directions for later reflections, then from everywhere in a very dense manner for both channels for what is often called the reverb tail. So the signal starts out in the left channel, then rapidly becomes more and more in both left and right channels, producing a 3D stereo image as you listen to it. The drop-down menu allows you to place sources on a semicircle that surrounds the microphone. L22 is 22.5 degrees to the left of the listener, L32 is 32 degrees to the left, and so on. You can choose stereo sources for instruments that are inherently stereo, or choose the left or right channel for mono sources. Normally, I myself use mono for anything that sits in one place and doesn't have stereo plugins operating on it. I do this for stereo recordings of many instruments because I want to create my own stereo images that are consistent across all the tracks of a mix using this RoomConvp program. However, for such instruments as a stereo piano, assuming that I like what they did, I'll use stereo. If I don't like the stereo piano and I can obtain a MIDI file and split the keyboard up to create a piano mix, then I do that. I also try to use mono for each piece of a drum kit unless I'm stuck with a stereo recording of the whole kit. I prefer to render my own drum tracks in a separate drum mix rather than use recorded stereo performances in the main mix. So many of my songs have two mixes. First, drums, then a second mix of the rendered drums plus everything else. The master volume knob is turned down to 50% by default at this time. I may change that. I did it because a really long exponential decay can easily produce overs at 100%, especially if the source is normalized at 0 dB. And finally, the rotational version just rotates the microphone around and around at varying speeds. The positions center, left 22, etc. don't mean much for the rotational version, of course, but there are differences in the modes and in the behavior of stereo versus mono that I will let you explore. I credit Will Pirkle, Pirkle, and his software Rack Effects, RACKAFX, without which these VST projects would have been considerably more difficult. As some of you may know, Will is an assistant professor of music engineering technology at the University of Miami Frost School of Music. Thanks very much, Will. And thank you, viewer, for your attention. That's it for now.